Good morning, everybody. I see almost everybody is awake. Let me also express my greatest thanks for not only this opportunity, but making it fun and enjoyed. I mean, I've said it before, Lausanne is really certainly one of my favorite cities, if not the most favorite city. So it's really a great environment. I also have to say that it's a little bit a climb down the last 2 days. You know, we were all talking among people who know and appreciate the importance of nutrition. So today, I think we have to recognize that we are dealing with customers, which is physicians and medical school curriculum committees, et cetera, who are much less appreciative. We really have great difficulty getting the attention, getting the space, holding learners to account that they actually know what we teach them. Very often it's just blown off. So what I'm trying to do today is kind of span the arch from looking at what is there and how it could be done, how we can do more. So we are really going to have far-ranging topics. So if I can... So just to get your attention, and you know I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's not generally appreciated that there is a major cost factor to lack of nutrition education because many deaths could be prevented. A lot of cost could be saved. A lot of outcomes could be improved if we paid attention, if particularly physicians, all the more than 1 million in the US, but also across the world, were well trained and understood how to recognize problems and how to address them. So there's no question that better educated physicians are more effective. So we're talking, these are just a few examples, just as a warm-up, in terms of pregnancy outcomes, in terms of well-being of children. We are setting them up for a lifetime of health or not. Here we get into costs. Hospital stays are very expensive, and every extra day, every readmission that becomes necessary because a patient was not properly nourished or because nutrition problems were not recognized are very costly. We have very simple, and probably most people will concede that, even if they say, no, nutrition, okay, you have to do it, that everybody recognizes that if physicians pay attention to the nutrition, that their patients have better blood pressure, better blood sugar, and other outcomes. So it's very, very basic. And we will come back to that, I want to emphasize that the role of the physician is very different from the role of dietitians. So the physician really very often only has to get the right word in, which may take seconds, where a dietitian then, very often in follow-up, may address issues more in depth. The physician sets the stage. If we are not really emphasizing and illustrating to the patients how important nutrition is, they are not going to pay attention to it. So it's really just about the right word at the right time. And that is what we are going to talk about today. This is a training issue because the right word doesn't just come up spontaneously. It is something that is learned. It's almost like a stage performance where you don't really have very much time, and when the point of the joke comes a little bit late, the joke falls flat. Likewise, if we don't right up front emphasize the importance, identify nutritional issues in clinical practice, the whole issue falls flat. So there's no question, and I'm starting from the US, but know that elsewhere it's not better. Very often it's even worse, that most physicians are not prepared. And they recognize that. So in one commonly cited, because it's one of the very few studies that actually has been done in that respect, resident physicians, 94% of them know that they should do it, that it is their responsibility, but almost none of them feels prepared. And we know that from exit surveys in medical school. Many students don't even realize they have been taught nutrition. They say, oh, we haven't been taught enough nutrition. And partially that is because nutrition typically is not called out appropriately. So there are components, let's say in endocrinology, metabolism, gynecology, etc., where there are little components sprinkled in, but they're not identified as nutrition. And that's very important because that fails to establish a framework of attention to nutrition where it's very clear, oh, I need to do these things, I need to do those things. Simple things like pregnancy weight gain. Yesterday, I read in The Guardian that midwives in the UK are coming back to some extent, following up on recent research, that maybe they should weigh their patients. And that actually has been a debate. So, very obvious things. In the US, our own experience, which we've done in the Bronx with high-risk patients, very few physicians discuss weight gain. I mean, a third. How can you accompany a woman through pregnancy without talking about weight gain? Telling them where they are, where they should be, guide them, help them. Discuss nutritional issues during a gynecology visit. Gynecologists are the primary care physicians of women, and it really falls to them to address issues. And again, we are not talking about extensive counseling, but really put in that one word. This needs to be taken care of. You need to really move in that direction. So I think it's very clear we need to do a lot of work. And this will be addressed later on, but I just want to summarize what I see, what physicians need to know about nutrition. And I think there's some misunderstanding, and that is reflected in how nutrition is taught in medical schools. First, and that's the least controversial, they need to know about nutrients and foods and how they work, etc. They don't know as much about foods, but they do get a lot of biochemistry physiology. So they do know that there's something like folate, etc. I'm least worried about that. And that's where more than 80% of the nutrition education actually takes place. There's much more obsession about structures than actual usage. But then it gets very sparse. They also need to know what clinical signs to look for. So they need to be able to do an assessment, very quick assessment. And there are many tools, let's say, for malnutrition in hospital patients, but also for well visits, etc. And they need to know how to respond to that. And this is where much less is done. And then finally, they need to know how to guide their patients through difficult changes. So there are always things that could be done better. And this is where they know least. There are no role models on the rounds or training, simulated patients, etc. So I'll be talking about that a little bit. But less than 5% or so of all medical nutrition education actually talks about how you get that across, how you deal with your patients, because you're not going to talk about structures. You know, you're not going to talk about, oh, you realize there are glutamate residues at your folate that are important. You're talking about, what are you going to do? At best, maybe about a few foods, good sources, etc. So we are really, I could have done a pyramid, but, you know, everybody else does pyramids, so. We are having the wrong emphasis. And particularly in terms of clinical skill sets, those are the hardest to provide because it requires that the instructors, particularly on the floors, etc., are educated themselves. And I think that's the major problem we have in nutrition, that very few of the senior physicians really are competent and ready to address nutrition issues. And usually the response is, I'll see a dietitian. The fact is there's no capacity. There's neither time nor capacity. Dietitians are not utilized to the extent they could and should. And if they are, they're usually utilized at the level of specialty issues like renal insufficiency or diabetes clinics maybe, but even there, they're not utilized enough. So it really falls to physicians to set the stage, but then also provide some of the services. So there is pretty much consensus that it takes a significant effort to really learn what needs to be known. And just to achieve basic competency, 25 hours across a 4-year US curriculum really is not very much. It comes to about 0.5% at most of the total curriculum hours. And this wouldn't be so bad if nutrition actually was sprinkled into other subjects, which it usually is not. So anybody looking at their curriculum can measure it. Do they actually reach that level? It's a very simple thing. Identify the number of hours, and that has been debated. Are the hours really reflective of the content? In a fairly crude way, they are. If you don't have the time, you cannot really teach. So what needs to be taught? Well, as I said, it's basic nutrition assessment, interventions, treatment of disease, and all of that has to be done in 25 hours or whatever. So we have done surveys. What is actually delivered, the latest one hasn't been completed, so we have a low response rate, and maybe we will be able to catch up on that. Reality is those things are never funded. So we have always done this on shoestring budgets on our own. But I think you get the picture that the median combined hours, and mind you, this is including biochemistry, physiology, and all those things, is just maybe 17, 18 hours across all 4 years. And this is just not enough. And what is very concerning is that there's an increasing trend for moving from required dedicated nutrition courses to integrated courses. That sounds good. It's the ideal. We really want to teach these things together and demonstrate how nutrition really is done. But in many cases now, there's no required nutrition instruction at all. And, you know, there are wonderful elective offerings. And I'm never counting them because I can assure you the physician who's going to treat you will have missed out on those opportunities. So I only count those hours that everybody has to take and pass, because only those translate in at you know, the public health level, at the outcome level, into really competency. Not those few highly motivated people who love to do nutrition, which certainly are around. But if 5% do it, what about the others? So how can we address these issues? Well, when we started out in the early 90s, the issue was that there was no capacity. Only about 25% of all medical schools in the US provided or required any nutrition education. Today, it's, as you have seen, more in the 90s, but how do you suddenly come up with all the capacity and the faculty who can teach that? So we decided there is a need for resources, and at the time, computer-based instruction started to mature, so we said, well, they can do some of that on their own, so we are not cutting into the turf of others by, you know, taking away curriculum hours, which would be, you know, very difficult, to put it mildly. And so far, we have generated more than 40 modules specifically for medical schools that are of different type. We have many basic modules that are full length of 50, 60 minutes, but we also have targeted modules that address in 10, 15 minutes or so specific issues. They consist of interactive exercises. We have animations and video cases, and you'll see a little bit of that, and run on standard computers. And they're currently used by the majority of US medical schools and also in many other countries. And we have been fortunate to have been funded by the usual suspects, who, however, now say, well, you're done, you're on your own for sustaining it. And it is a huge problem, sustaining such an undertaking on a shoestring. So this is what it looks like. We have lessons, we have tools that people can work with, we have case studies, we intersperse it with questions of all kinds and challenges. And I don't want to get into the details. I invite everybody to go there. Let me know if you want to have access. It's controlled with an access code simply because we want to provide guidance. So does it make a difference? Well, maybe. In the 2012 survey, we could show that medical schools who used our courses then provided significantly more nutrition education. Now, that could have been because it was easier for them to do it, because, you know, they don't have to hire more instructors, which would be great if they did that, or because they are just more tuned to their need for nutrition education. We also use other media channels. So this, for instance, we have done a series of YouTube shorts that are really kind of teasers to raise their interest and then link to our modules, because one of the issues is always the instructors are constantly changing at medical schools. Turnover is more than a third per year because very often non-specialist instructors, so the youngest physician on staff is assigned, oh, you do that, and then they move on, and somebody else gets that dumped in their lap. So we do want to have those here. That is, one example where we want to illustrate how to utilize dietitians in clinical practice, because physicians don't know about that. They don't know what dietitians do and how they can utilize them, but we have also other topics like refeeding syndrome, etc. So there are some situations where it's particularly useful, and this is just food for thought. So if there are team-taught courses, as it very often is the case, that there may be 4 or 8 instructors. So there's a common thread, just like you would use a textbook. But these modules can provide a basis, so kind of the rote teaching, and then the instructors can build on that and work through cases or other interesting materials. Very often the challenge is that there are few learners at a time at a site. That, like when you talk about clerkships, certainly also later on, residency, many have only 1 or 2 residents in a particular subject, and it's very difficult to arrange for the instruction. So it's a very good resource. Now we also have a lot of university and medical schools that have divided campuses, so they have multiple sites. And how do you reach across those, and do they have to travel to the main site? Here, it's an opportunity to do instruction across geographically fairly large areas. So just to give you a sense how it's built up, this is a short module on refeeding syndrome. And I'm not going to go through all the components. These ones that I show you are just to illustrate how we go about. Everything has an objective, so we want to identify what they're really responsible for, and we test them on that, and we follow up on that. There are summaries at the end, as you'll see in a moment. So we do first pass instruction, which may be text-based, etc. Don't mind the particulars here. There's a common thread, for instance, of anorexia that I highlighted just so you see how we do that, but it's very broadly based, as it should be for refeeding syndrome. And then we reinforce, and mind you, this is not in sequence, it's just taking components. We reinforce with exercises. We find, for instance, these sorting exercises very powerful because you cannot game it very easily, and you engage with a much broader range of pieces than what you would do with a multiple choice question. So they have to sort it into low risk, high risk for refeeding syndrome, which of course is one of the key issues, because once you identified it, you can pull in people who know. But if you don't identify, that concerns all practicing clinicians. So then when you're done, it gives you an account, what you got right, what you got wrong. And the interesting thing is, it gives you a quantitative measure. When you do a multiple choice, it's either right or wrong. But here you can actually say, well, you get many right, or you get all of them right, or you get none of them right. So it's very quantitative and is really giving you much more information. And mind you, we collect that information so that we can actually use that, for instance, for adaptive learning. So if you didn't get it, then you get more of the same in a different percentage, in a different way, making sure that you really understand the principles and have learned something, which is one of my main criticisms of taping lectures and just use passive learning. We actually know how learners progress. Do they get it? Do they not learn properly? So these kind of interspersed assessments help us to then say, okay, you're a very fast learner, you get it all, or you pay attention, then you don't need the extra, and you progress much more quickly. Or you need a little bit extra, whatever that may be. This is just one example. So make it interactive. So it's not just a page and then, but actually make learners push a button or, really figure out what is where, very key. Another type of exercise, ask them to integrate and synthesize what they have learned. So here, obviously, clinically, they actually have to decide on the treatment. So these are case-based presentations, case-based challenges, where they now have to select from these drop-down options how much and what they have to provide. So it really comes down to the specifics. Either they learned it or they didn't, and we will know. If they didn't learn it, so, we can use different tools to strengthen instruction. So maybe somebody has to memorize more. So we use the old flashcard paradigm, and they can go through it as long as they need to. We use a lot of pop quizzes. They're very popular because they're simple, non-threatening. And these are just reminders. So that basically makes you think about what you just learned and stay on topic. And then, of course, we do have proper assessments. I have tried to move away from conventional multiple choice questions, very simply because they're off-putting and they are considered burdensome. They're also hard to generate. But we have them because that is the accepted way of assessment. So we are able to do with a conventional assessment learning outcomes that we provide to course directors. So they then get the scores if they want to and can use it for their grades. So there is a hard outcome. If we do sorting exercises, it would be harder to fit into our current thinking because, they don't know how quantitative it is, et cetera. So we use those more internally for our own assessment to drive the narrative. And then we have references that are really summarizing everything they learned in this component so they can look it up. And a lot of that is, you forget about it. Another one, I'm going to go through that very quickly. Another example is behavior change counseling. And as I said before, these are really the things medical students need to learn, physicians need to know. Most of them don't. So we do the usual stages of change, and other models get that across, and they do learn that quite well. Various models. So what we have done is, as I said, physicians need to be prepared to say the specific words, not come up at the moment when we're going to say, but actually learn that and think about it beforehand, because it's going to be the same thing over and over again. So this is just one of those examples where they actually get a hands-on guidance. How do you do that? And they can do practice. So again, when motivational interviewing, how do you do that? You have specific situations and then suggestions for the phrasing that you can use. So they actually have done it. So it's probably the closest thing to actual training session, which they will never get with a good mentor and trainer. We use exercises, so they can practice and do more or fewer of them. So in this case, we have patient scenarios, and think about what you would say to this patient next. I mean, we are talking about largely oral transactions, so it's not just ordering something, but you actually work with the patient. So they can think about it, and they get an explanation which is, something that they should know, but now it's reinforced. And then we use video-based interactions. Now, unfortunately, I cannot play the actual interaction. I encourage you to try it out. These are challenge cases. They are actually timed exercises, a little bit like an OSCE session or something like that, where you have to figure out, in this case, about what nutrients this particular patient would be low in relating to neural tube defect risk. So how do you figure that out? And, of course, it is not going to be a 24-hour recall, because how long would that take? And would they even understand all the significance of individual nutrients? So we actually use brief questions where we emphasize what are major sources. And here they have to then ask those about those sources. And this exercise is a little bit mean because whenever they select something that's not relevant, let's say in this case we want to know about folate, B12, B6, so we ask about apples, pears, and peaches, which wouldn't be such a great question if you know what you're asking about. So she actually goes on and runs your time out. So, it's to emphasize that it's a time thing. You don't have time in practice, and you have to do it quickly, and you have to get to the point quickly. We have also done, as a prototype, a virtual patient, and I think we need much more of that. We know that simulated patients are very popular, but we don't really have anything in nutrition. So there always have been simulated patients in all areas of medical care, and they are very expensive simulations. But we need similar things for nutrition. So this one is a patient who, unfortunately, we haven't done Siri yet with voice recognition. That's the next step. But you can do it with text-based question options. And then the patient will respond. And if you don't do it, the patient, gets upset, and you have this board where you have indicators of patient attitude on the right, how well you do in terms of motivational interviewing, use of stages of change on the left. So you see continuously how is your patient responding. And the important thing about this is, number one, you can use it as much as you want, so you can actually train, which, you can try out things. If you don't do anything, the patient is going to walk out on you. I mean, just for fun. But if you do it wrong, you can actually try out. And we have heard from users who did not do well in this, that they just want to try out what happens if I do it that way. So they really engage at a much deeper level. So we have used these modules, just 1 hour worth of them, in the Bronx at Albert Einstein, in an obstetrics residency program, where we actually made and paid residents to do it. It really takes a lot of arm twisting because they have no time, and you need very good collaboration of the residency directors. And what you really want to do is, of course, you want to see where they are, and after they've done it, how much did they learn? So that's how it's usually done. Do they answer your questions correctly? But that's not very meaningful. So here we did practice patterns. So we looked at what they are actually doing. And this is something that has been done before, even to the extent in the Netherlands of sending in trained patients, simulated patients, to assess how the doctors are doing. But even there, it was done only once. We need much more of that. So what you can see is 1 hour of this online instruction, and this is verified. We made sure they actually did the hour. It was in a supervised setting. We didn't trust them to do it at home. There are, like advice about gestational weight gain, where only a third of them usually did it. Not only did that increase, the instruction increased the knowledge about that, but 3 months later, when there was, the memory was long gone, they had persisted in much higher frequency. And, this is really great. So this is the kind of thing that we need to achieve, that practice patterns change, that physicians actually in their interaction with their patients achieve lower weight, lower blood pressure, whatever it is, achieve better birth outcomes, anything in the long run. Not this short-term, okay, I study for, like in medical school, study for my exam and then I forget about it. Who remembers all the biochemistry pathways 3 years later, right? Not even I. So this is very important. So I think it's very clear that we have a problem. Too few medical schools prepare their students. And there is clearly a lack of urgency, and I could go on and on. I'm sure in our discussion it will come up, that most of our colleagues just don't see the point. That's just not needed. Clinical training is the most important part. We don't have to worry about them knowing that what folate is, etc. But what do you do with that kind of thing? We need role modeling, which I haven't even addressed because it would entail training their mentors and trainers who are not ready. And then it's very important to do a multi-layered approach, not a quick wash, you have 2 weeks of nutrition and isn't that great, look what we're doing. So it truly is not just the number of hours, but how they are structured within the curriculum and is their persistence. So I think everybody can agree that something needs to change. I think we know how to do it. We just have to do it. I want to thank my team over the years. They all have been highly motivated, and it's a very integrated team. So we have all kinds of PhDs and dietitians and programmers who contributed to that. And it takes a lot of resources to maintain something like that, which unfortunately right now is not there. I finally want to make a pitch for our new BMJ Nutrition Journal. Encourage all of you to consider submitting. We are particularly interested in getting submissions that relate to nutrition in practice, helping physicians. BMJ is a physician's journal, helping physicians to use nutrition in practice. So we are less interested in mechanisms and trials, etc. We want to know what works. So do contact me if you have any questions. And I hope we hear from you about that. But you also are invited to contact me about the nutrition programs. I hope to get both use, but also collaborators. We are trying currently to do this in a more broad-based way, integrate also globally. We already have a fairly broad global reach, but we can do much better. There are opportunities to do that. Thank you.